Welcome everyone to this Back to Basics session. For those of you who don't know, I'm Elaine McIlroy, one of the partners in the Employment and Immigration team at Brodie's, and with me today is Erin McLafferty, who's an associate in the team. And we thought the idea of having this Back to Basics series of 3 was to give HR practitioners and also in-house lawyers some information about some of the basics of immigration. So instead of talking about legal developments, which we do sometimes, we thought would sort of bring it back to basics. So the one today, we want to be as practical as possible, and it's going to give you hopefully the tools that you need if you're planning to apply for a sponsor license. And some of the statistics from UKVI over the past year or so have shown that there's a vast increase of in terms of the numbers of organisations applying for sponsor licenses. So the register of sponsors has gone up hugely, and part of that is the Brexit effect and part of that sort of recovery from the COVID pandemic. But anyway, today the session is going to be in 2 parts. The agenda slide you can see in front of you there. I'm going to start by talking about identifying your key personnel, which is one of the first steps in applying for a sponsor licence, how to complete the online application form, what supporting documents you're going to need, and then Erin is going to talk about some additional information you need to include with your application in relation to your business and your new recruit, how to prioritise your application if it's urgent, and she'll talk about timing and costs, and also some common pitfalls, because I guess over the years we've helped lots and lots of organisations with sponsor licenses, so learning from their mistakes if they've had applications rejected, etc., is hopefully useful for you. So let's get started then with the first part, which is, as I said, identifying your key personnel. So each organisation, if you want to apply for a sponsor licence, is asked to identify certain employees or office holders, so that could be a director, to fulfil certain roles for the purposes of the sponsor licence. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about what some of those roles are. But one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that at least one of your key personnel and your level 1 user must be a settled worker. And there is a definition in the detailed policy guidance, which is available online, about who is a settled worker, but that includes British and Irish passport holders. It also includes people with status under the EU settlement scheme and people with indefinite leave to remain, but it excludes certain types of short-term visa holders. So it's worth bearing that in mind if you're picking who is going to fulfil these roles for the sponsor licence. You can have one person carry out all of the roles, and some organisations, especially smaller ones, find that easier. Then you don't need to put in lots of different people's details into the application. But other organisations prefer to pick one person to be the authorising officer and then a different person perhaps to fulfil the role of level 1 user. But it is possible for one person to hold all of those roles. It makes sense, first of all, to start with who's going to be your authorising officer, as that's the person that's going to be involved in completing the online application form. It's not possible for them to kind of delegate that because there's declarations and things that need to be made online. And then also remember that criminal record checks are going to be carried out on your key personnel, and they will also check that those individuals are not undischarged bankrupts or disqualified as directors. They want to make sure that the people are suitable to fulfil those roles. So the authorising officer is the most important person for the purposes of the sponsor licence application. They've to be the most senior person in your organisation who's responsible for the recruitment of migrant workers. And they are also ultimately responsible for the actions of other users under the licence. They are the person that should have kind of oversight over the sort of compliance processes that you've got in place. And in one of our other Back to Basics sessions, in fact number 3, we're going to talk a bit more about the compliance obligations there. But the authorising officer should be senior because they're the person who is responsible for oversight over those systems and processes. And UKVI might want to meet that person if they decide to do a compliance visit with you. That person doesn't automatically get login details to use the system. If you do want that person to have those login details, you would probably add them as a level 1 user as well. The key contact is the person who UKVI would contact on a day-to-day basis about sort of day-to-day matters. And then the level 1 user is the person who will get login details to access the online sponsor management system, and that's the system that's used for the employer to actually be able to go out and sponsor individuals. So they'll be able to do things like issue certificates of sponsorship to staff, etc. And your first level 1 user must be either an employee or a director or other office holder. It's possible to add on additional level 1 users at a later date who don't need to be employees. They could be external representatives like lawyers, for example, but your first one, and you must have at least one who's an employee. And it definitely makes sense once you've got the license in place to add on an additional level 1 user so that you've got cover for holiday absences or sickness absences, etc. That person, as I said, can be an outsourced HR consultant as well, as long as you also have an employee in the role. So let's move on to the next slide, which is the second stage of the process, which is to complete the online application form. So an online form needs to be completed with various bits of information about your business. And that, as I said, does need to be completed by the authorising officer. There is a section for a legal representative to add their details partway through the form. So the form allows you to create it, save it, and you can save it partway through and then add in, for example, your legal representative's details and then go back into it. And it is useful to be able to create the form, save it for a while, go off and check that you've got your documents ready before you go ahead and submit. And we would usually recommend that you did that so that you have the form ready and then you've got your documents ready before you kind of press go. The form asks mainly factual information about your business, so much of it is straightforward about where, what sector you operate in, where you do business geographically, details of your registered office, etc. But some things to think about when you're creating the information for the form is how you're going to sort of structure your license application. So for some organisations, they will just have one employing entity. Others might have 2 or 3 employing entities, and there's a decision to be made there about whether you put all of those onto the single application or whether you want to have separate sponsor licenses for each employing entity. For other businesses, they might have several locations where migrant workers might work. If so, ensure that you add all of those addresses onto the application, and those are sometimes referred to as branches. Also consider before you apply which fee is going to apply to your sponsor license application. There's a small employer fee and then there's a larger one. The small one also applies to charities, etc. There's detailed guidance available about which fee to pay, but if you do pay the wrong fee, that can result in your license application being rejected. So it is important to make sure if you're going to use the small employer fee that you are entitled to do so. And there's special rules about financial services organisations, etc., which often have to pay the larger fee. So do check the detailed rules on that. Another point to think about before you complete the form is whether you're going to apply just for the skilled worker route or whether you're also going to apply for intra-company transfers on your sponsor licence. Some organisations go for one or the other and some go for both. At the moment, there are few benefits to using the intra-company transfer route, so some organisations might just go for the skilled worker route, but in a year's time there is going to be an exemption from the immigration skills charge, which is going to make intra-company transfers a bit cheaper than the skilled worker route in some cases. So think about whether you need that on your licence, whether you're going to be transferring people from group companies overseas. It doesn't cost any more in terms of the licence application fee to have both routes on your licence, but you would need additional paperwork, and that can sometimes add some time and complexity in preparing your licence application. Finally, complete the form. As I said, save it as you go. Don't submit until you've got your documents ready to go, because when you do submit, you're expected to sign and print the submission sheet and then submit with your supporting documents within 5 working days. So if you haven't started to prepare those, you might be playing catch up. So it makes sense to have the documents ready before you submit. Just some screenshots here to show you roughly what the online application form looks like. This screen has information about the business, its registered office, etc., prior trading names, and then the geographical areas where you operate. And if we look at the next page, that's a screenshot of additional information where you can include numerous locations or branches on your license or other group companies. So that's the page where you would add that if appropriate. And then on this third page, this shows you an example of one of the screens where you would add details of the person that you want to sponsor. This only applies to undefined certificates of sponsorship that you're planning to issue, which is basically for individuals who are already working in the UK and who are going to be switching in country into the skilled worker route, or who are coming under an intra-company transfer application. It doesn't ask for information about details of people who are currently overseas applying to come in. So do check the definition of undefined certificates of sponsorship before you add the details here. And when you do add the details, you're expected to add quite a lot of information about the people you plan to sponsor. And then on this page here, this is the sort of information you have to complete about your key personnel. There's similar pages for each of your authorising officer, your level 1 user, your key contact, etc. And you're expected to have things like their national insurance number if you've got it, and details of the address should be their work address rather than a personal one. So in terms of supporting documents, I would say this is a really critical bit to get right, and a bit that is probably the most common reason for licence applications being rejected is that people don't submit the correct supporting documents with the right information. There's a document online that gives you guidance about what supporting document you need to submit, and it's called Appendix A if you're searching on UKBI's sort of website for that. The types of documents to be submitted depend on what type of organisation you are, and sometimes what type of sector you operate in, and whether you have any kind of mandatory registrations with various bodies. But generally most organisations will submit 4 documents and an up-to-date hierarchy chart, which needs to outline details of your directors and board members, and also details of the ownership of the company. If your organisation's got less than 50 people, that chart also has to show the names of, or the lists of all employees and their job titles. So it's quite a detailed hierarchy chart that needs to get submitted. And then in terms of the actual supporting documents, you can now usefully send a scan of these electronically. It used to be the case that you had to submit them all by post, but UKBI do reserve the right to ask for the hard copies within 5 working days. So I would say it's useful to have in the background on file hard copies of the originals or certified copies. And UKBI don't just accept sort of photocopies. If they do ask for these to be submitted, they want copies certified by a lawyer, or some of them have to be certified by an accountant. So bear in mind, Appendix A is specific. Do read through and check all the relevant information is on the documents that you're submitting. So for example, if it's a bank statement, it needs to be the most recent one. If it's a letter from the bank, it'll tell you exactly what it needs to say. Similarly with other documents like employer's liability insurance certificates, it will tell you exactly what information you must show, and you must get that bit right. If you are relying on bank statements which are electronic or other downloads from the HMRC portal, do make sure that you could obtain hard copies or suitable certified copies within 5 working days if you need to do that. If you are certifying documents for UKBI, there's guidance on their website about exactly how to do it. And again, that was a common reason why documents used to get bounced, or applications were bounced, because that wasn't done correctly. They do expect it to be done in the right way. And yeah, sending incorrect and inadequate documents can lead to delays or rejections of your application. So do take advice if you're unsure. And also it's worth bearing in mind that certain documents like accounts which are available on a company's house website, you can sometimes put a link in your cover letter rather than to have to send sort of clunky documents with your application. So I'm going to hand over to Erin at this point.
Great, thanks Elaine. So on top of the supporting documents, UKBI also ask for a bit of extra mandatory information that's not included on your online form. Some of that information relates to any recruits that you've identified and want to sponsor. Some of the information they ask for are things like their full name, date of birth, nationality, immigration status, etc. There's also some additional information they want to know about your business. That includes the reasons why you want to get a sponsor license, the sector that you operate in, your opening and operating hours. Also things like your link to your website, and that is often missed by employers, and also the landline number if you've got one. The full comprehensive list of everything that they want to know is in Appendix A, which is also the document that you look at for supporting documents. So do go through that and methodically check that you've got the information. The best way we usually recommend that employers present that to UKVI is through a cover letter, and just include that as a kind of additional supporting document along with your application. So those are the key stages to be aware of if you're going to make a licence application, but it also, we thought it'd be helpful to just recap on costs and timing. So as Elaine mentioned, there is two separate fees for applying for a sponsor licence. There's one for smaller employers, and that's £536, and that's for a 4-year period. And then for medium and larger employers, the fee is £1,476. As Elaine mentioned, a smaller employer is a defined term, so do always check if it applies to you. If it does, then that's great, because you do pay a third of what other employers pay, but do just be doubly sure that it definitely does apply to you, and I'll chat a bit about that in the next slide, about why that's important. There's also some additional fees payable each time you come to sponsor someone, and they're on the slide there. I won't go into too much detail just now, but worth being aware of that if you go down the sponsorship route, there is kind of fees per sponsorship that you pay. In terms of timing then, so when you come to apply for a sponsor licence, in our experience, it usually takes a couple of weeks to have the application itself drafted and to collate the supporting documents that Elaine mentioned. It can be done quicker, it just depends how accessible those documents are in your particular circumstances. Once you've got them all together and you've submitted your application, the standard service time that UKVI have for processing is up to 8 weeks. I guess in 2019, if you'd asked me how much time is it realistically taking to process a licence application, we probably would have said probably around 4 to 5 weeks. But currently in 2022, and as a result, I think, of COVID and Brexit, the Home Office are very busy with these applications, and it is realistically taking probably the best part of 8 weeks for your licence application to be processed. That timing is not guaranteed, and it can be longer if UKVI regard your application as complex, or if they select you for a pre-licence compliance check. So do always bear in mind that you're probably looking at 8 weeks, but that's not guaranteed. There is also an expedited service, which is worth being aware of. It costs an extra £500 to use, and UKVI do aim to come back to you within 10 working days on a response with your application. But for your own knowledge, it's only for what UKVI regard as straightforward applications, and they will email you if they regard you as meeting that kind of qualification. But they only take 10 applications a day for that expedited service, and on average they receive over 200 applications each day. So that should hopefully give you a bit of an indication of how busy they are, and it does usually involve sending an application repetitively for a number of days, even weeks, and even then it's not guaranteed. But if you don't have 8 weeks to spare, it's definitely recommended that you try and use that service if you can. So next then, we thought we'd cover some common pitfalls and some of the things that we see employers do that cause issues with their application. First of all, employers not including all of the employing entities in the UK or places of work on their licence application. It's not fatal to a sponsor licence application if you don't include all this detail, but you do have to list all of the employing entities or places of work in order to have anyone you sponsor work for that entity or at that location. If you don't, then you cannot have them based there, so that could lead to operational issues if you don't do it at the beginning. It is possible to add on those locations or group entities at a later date, and the process for applying isn't complicated in itself, but it can take up to 18 weeks for those applications to be processed. So do bear that in mind. That is quite a long wait, and there isn't an option to expedite those requests at present. So the more detail you can include on your structure at the beginning, hopefully the better it all works out operationally, and avoids all those types of delays. Elaine also touched on making sure you know what fee is payable for you, and that is important. If you are a small employer, it's great to take benefit of the lower fee, but if you are a medium or larger employer and you pay the small fee, that will usually lead to your application being rejected, which is not great, and it does mean that you've lost kind of up to 8 weeks of processing time just to have to go and make the application again. So do make sure that you do double, triple check that point. Definitely take advantage where it applies, but don't kind of chance it and just have a go at trying to get away with the small fee, because they will usually come back and tell you it's wrong and reject your application. Another kind of common issue we see with applications are that all the supporting documents aren't being sent in line with the guidance. UKVI are very specific about what they accept, and they're very specific about the detail that those documents have to contain. Some of the common things we see are the hierarchy charts, not including all of the information that UKVI require. They do need to know ownership structure and who owns the company that's applying for the sponsor license. So do make sure that you include that information. They also do like to know where if you've identified an individual, they like to know where they sit on that hierarchy chart within your business. So do make sure you include those details. Also, in terms of the documentation that you send, make sure that all of the names that those documents are addressed to match, and that they are the name of the entity that's applying for the sponsor license. Sometimes where you've got a group company structure in the United Kingdom, not every document, for example, not all your bank statements, not all of your HMRC documents might be in the name of the organisation applying for the licence. It is usually important that they do all match and are the same across the board. And if that's not the case, or if you cannot get those documents, it's important to make sure you take advice, because sometimes it is acceptable and sometimes it's not. So just bear that in mind. Also, things like bank statements, make sure that they're most recent and they're not out of date. UKVI do require those statements to be the most recent ones you've been issued with. And also your tax documents, UKVI only accept HMRC issued copies. So again, bear that in mind, and just be really thorough with Appendix A, and attention to detail is absolutely critical. If you're not sure of anything, then do make sure you take advice as appropriate. So a couple of things just before you get to submitting, just to bear in mind. When you apply for a sponsor license and press the button to submit, you are also ensuring to UKVI that you can comply with your sponsor license obligations. You should consider that before you press the button on your license application itself. We won't cover that today, but do have a look at some of our other Back to Basics series that are coming. We will cover the compliance obligations in more detail, so do make sure you have a look at that if that's important. And UKVI do also have comprehensive guidance on how to apply for a sponsor license, and also the Appendix A document that we've mentioned. Today is just a bit of a kind of taster of the things that you should bear in mind, but it isn't comprehensive, and the guidance is out there, so do check that or take advice. Also, just before we go to the question and answers element of today's session, just important to remember that when you're submitting a licence application, you can appoint a representative to help you. Some employers do that, some choose not to, and that's absolutely fine. But if you do, then you do have to make sure that they are a lawyer, or that they're regulated by the OISC in the UK to provide immigration advice. And that's because immigration advice is tightly regulated in the United Kingdom. So they do have to have that kind of regulation to be the representative on the form itself, and to also help you in the background with getting your documents together, and to give you advice on the licence application itself. Anyone else cannot be a representative for the purposes of your application, so just bear that in mind, and that it can be a criminal offence for that advice to be given, so just bear that all in mind. So now we'll look to the question and answers element of today's session. We have had some questions come in, so we will just get started. Someone has asked, if an employer leaves employment before the end of their visa, are there any fees that the employer can claim back from UK visas and immigration? I guess there's two elements to a sponsorship process. There's getting the licence, and I guess having that is an asset in itself, because it means you're ready to sponsor anyone that you want to sponsor in the future. The next step to employing someone who needs a visa under the skilled worker route is to actually sponsor them. And that's where there's certain fees such as health surcharges, visa fees themselves, and the immigration skills charge are payable. The visa fee is not refundable, so I guess you pay it once for a 4-year period and that's it. You don't pay it again until you're up for renewal, but if you give up your license you also don't get a refund. If you have an individual you're sponsoring and you've paid some of those fees I mentioned up front, it can be possible to get some refunds on a kind of proportional amount of those fees, particularly the immigration skills charge, if the individual leaves employment with you earlier than anticipated. So it does depend on how much you paid and the kind of time left on their visa. So worth bearing that in mind. Another question we've had is, what is a typical timing from start to finish for applying for a sponsor license?
So I guess we've talked about timing a bit already. I would say to factor in 1 or 2 weeks for the kind of preparation stages of pulling together your supporting documents and drafting your form, etc. Roughly 8 weeks for UKVI to process it, and as you said, you can't guarantee that you're going to get one of those priority slots, so that takes you to about 10 weeks. But as you said, that's not kind of guaranteed. It's possible you might get a sort of compliance visit before they grant you the license, and if they do, that might take a number of weeks. So in theory, it could take even longer. So the main point, I guess, or the takeaway from that is, even if you haven't identified a migrant worker that you want to sponsor right now, if you're thinking that you might need to over the coming years, then I would say get the sponsor license in place now before it becomes a rush. It's much worse to identify the migrant worker, have someone that you want to recruit, and then to have to sort of face these sort of 3-month or so sort of timescales to get the license in place, and you really need that before you can issue the certificate of sponsorship to them and get cracking on the visa process. And sometimes candidates will walk away rather than wait for that kind of time lag if they've got an alternative offer. Somebody just asking if the slides will be available. We will send those on, and there is also the recording available later. You got any other questions coming in, Erin?
Yep, so I think we've got time for one more. Someone's asked, if we don't appoint a representative and we do it ourselves, are there any consequences if we do it wrong and our license application isn't successful?
So if you get it wrong just because you've, say, submitted insufficient documents, etc., they will usually reject it. You could waste quite a lot of time, but ultimately you would be then able to submit a fresh sponsor license application. So for example, if you don't submit some of the mandatory documents, they would bounce it, but you might have wasted a few weeks and then you're starting all over again. So there can be consequences in terms of that. If they actually refuse your application as opposed to just sort of reject it based on you not having sent them the right stuff, if they actually refuse it, which could be because of a poor compliance history on immigration, for example, if you'd had civil penalties in the past, etc., they can apply cooling off periods, which basically prevent you from applying again. Some of those cooling off periods are 12 months, some of them are longer, and the policy guidance does tell you all the detail of that. But I would say if you're in that type of scenario where you've got a poor record of compliance, or there's been a problem and you've been actually refused, you would probably want to go and take advice in that scenario, because that's not a straightforward situation there. Okay, I think that's us about time at the moment. So as I said, we will be running 2 other sessions. We'll send you details of those 2 other sessions in case you're interested in those in the follow-up when we send you the recording, and please do register for those and get in touch if you think of any other questions. Thanks.
Thanks.